Okay, if you quieten down, please, we'll make a start. See, can you guys hear me all right? Is there sound coming through? There's no sound. No sound. No sound. Is the sound coming? There's some sound now. Sound now? Yeah. Okay. Can you guys hear all right over there, or is the sound okay for you guys? Okay. Okay, how's that? Is that better? Okay, good. Right, what about you guys in the back? You okay for sound? You still want more, right? Okay. Okay, how's that? Is that better? Okay. And you guys okay now? Okay, and you guys in the middle are fine. Okay. Right. Okay, so let's make a start. So next week's going to be the first online quiz, and that quiz will cover everything from the overview up until the end of this particular topic here on the Reserve Bank. I'll give you more details on Friday about that quiz, but that's the topics that will be included in from the overview through to the end of this particular topic here. So today we'll start the topic essentially on central banks. The one in particular we're going to be looking at is the central bank in Australia, the Reserve Bank of Australia. But the way they manage their system over there is very common. Once you understand how they do it, you can pretty much go to any central bank in the world and see that they do something very similar to what these people do. One of the main tasks of the central banks of the world is actually trying to manage the economy. And the tools that they have are very limited, and in many cases they're quite ineffective, they're slow to work. And so what we're going to be looking at is basically their tool of monetary policy, which is the management of the short-term interest rates and liquidity within the financial system, how they go about that, and how we hope that their management of that will feed into the wider economy. Now, if you find central banks interesting at all, I do recommend this particular book here, The End of Alchemy, by Mervyn King. Mervyn King was the governor of the Bank of England between 2003 and 2013. So that's their central bank. So he was a central bank governor for 10 years, and prior to that he was a deputy governor, and prior to that he was their head economist. And it's a very interesting book. It is primarily, in one sense, a financial crisis book, but he comes at it from a central banker's point of view. And if you read any other financial crisis books, almost always the word greed appears multiple times. I'm told reliably, even though I looked myself, I didn't see it, that the word greed does not appear in this book. So, very interesting book written by a central banker who lived through the crisis period and had to try to manage the crisis within Great Britain. So, interesting book if you want to read that one. So, this is an outline where we're going to go. I'm going to basically ask the question, where on earth did central banks come from? Then we'll go on to talk about the money supply, what it is, how they measure it, then the cash rate, which is their central tool in the monetary policy, and how they actually manage that cash rate, and then how this management of the cash rate is supposed to feed through into the wider economy. So asking where, why we might have these things, as we'll come to fairly soon, central banks, which can go under several different names, Reserve Bank of New Zealand, Reserve Bank of Australia, are central banks. Sometimes things like European Central Bank is actually called central bank. Something like the Bank of England doesn't have either name in its title, but it's considered to be a central bank. So reserve banks and central banks are reasonably interchangeable terms. And virtually every country, there's few exceptions, very few exceptions, almost every country in the world has one, or like the United States, actually got a dozen of them. But they're a relatively recent invention as far as financial system goes. And we think, well, what do they do? If you look at financial crises, and we talked about financial crises being one of the major drivers of changes within the financial system, and in the last 20 years we've had quite a number of them. These ones are comparatively small ones, that were small on a worldwide scale, not small for the people involved, but like the Asian crisis, Brazilian crisis, Turkish financial crisis, Argentine crisis, and there's other ones that we could add in there. All of them were very significant for the countries involved and the people that were lived in those countries. But a common factor in these ones was that their central banks were not considered to be strong central banks. They often had inadequate legislation, inadequate powers of regulation. They had inadequate powers to deal with the problems that they had. And so one of the reasons those crises were actually probably worse than they could have been was their central banks were not able to effectively deal with the problems that were occurring within those countries. Now, if we look at the big one, the most recent big one in 2008, that is mainly an exception in the sense that the central banks that were involved there were not weak. They had wide-ranging powers of regulation. They had wide-ranging powers to intervene into the markets. They provide liquidity as necessary. When there were failures in banks and other financial institutions, they were often very closely involved in putting together rescue efforts, and they moved very swiftly, very decisively to try to deal with the problems that were unfolding at the time. But even so, that particular crisis proved very difficult to manage. Now, it seems finally after, nearly 9 years after these events, that we're finally coming out of this, and there was fears for quite a long time that we might end up in a depression, but ultimately we seem to have come to a point where the world economy seems to be recovering from this and does seem to be growing. Now, within that lot, there were particular parts of the world that fared worse than others. The US and Great Britain fared particularly badly. New Zealand and Australia did well, and we've talked about Iceland before as being a place that fared badly. Now, we may ask the question, where did these things come from? Because if you look back into history, banks have existed for a very long time. We have very clear evidence of the existence of banks or institutions very like banks for at least 4,000 years. We have sketchy reports of things like banks even beyond 4,000 years ago. Almost from the time of the invention of writing, something like banks have existed. And where good records exist, say for example with Rome or Greece, the banks there had exactly the same problems that they have today. They had small amounts of capitalization. They were often very illiquid. They would sometimes have runs on the bank, would put them out of business. And so the problems with banks, have been known for thousands of years, and no one's managed to fix them yet. Now, if we look about, at that, banks and banking systems haven't actually existed continuously across time. When the Roman Empire disintegrated, and particularly Europe went into a rather unfortunate period called the Middle Ages, the banks and banking systems that had been in existence in the time of Rome eventually ended up, there were basically none left. And so when we're looking at the modern banking system, we trace it back to this time and place in Italy, northern part of Italy in the 1300s. And so the modern banks and banking systems have basically been developing for about 700 years now. How they actually got started was that these particular cities, Florence, Genoa, Venice, were trading cities, particularly grain trading in the Mediterranean. And of course, there were some people who were wealthy out of this grain trading, and they needed strong rooms. They had armed guards to protect their wealth, and they simply began to offer relatively simple banking services. So if they had a vault, they had armed guards, they began to take deposits and began to make small amounts of loans, and that's how things began then. They were simply all privately owned, mostly owned by a family. There was no such thing as a publicly owned company. When we look at the state-owned ones, the first one that we know of, 1407 in Genoa, this Banco di San Giorgio, that's the Bank of St. George. It was really no different to any other bank at the time, except that it was owned by the city rather than by a family. Now, at that time, each bank issued its own banknotes. And if you think about banknotes and coins today, we who have grown up in our age, we think that the banknotes are valuable stuff and the coins are the stuff that's not worth very much. For most of history, it was the other way around. The real value was in the coins because the coins were made out of gold and silver. In some cases, like Northern Europe, they had heavy copper coins, but they were intrinsically valuable. And what the banknote did when it issued, what the bank did when it issued its own banknotes was essentially it was a promise to give you real money in exchange for the banknote. So if you had a banknote from a bank and you wanted some real money for that banknote, you would go into it, you would present it, and then they would go to their vault and get you either silver, gold, as may be, and give it to you, and you would take the real money away. Now that did create a problem for trade, is that the further you got away geographically from a bank, the less you could trust their banknotes. I mean, if you knew your local bank, you knew something about it, you may be able to trust their banknotes. But if you went down the road, say a few hundred kilometers, you may not be able to trade your banknotes because of a lack of trust. So into this began to step, and it took at least a couple of hundred years to fully develop the modern central bank. Now, usually when you're thinking of the history of central banks, typically the one they think about is Bank of England. That's probably because it's English speaking. But they started this bank. It was started by the government in 1694. They were at war. What they wanted to do with this bank was simply create a bank to bring money in so they could finance their war. That's what they created it for. And from that point, simply created for the purposes of raising money for a war, this particular bank acquired, over the next 200 years, the functions that we consider to be the functions of a central bank. So moving on in time, over 100 years into the 1830s, the British government made this bank, Bank of England, the sole issuer of notes and coins. And so instead of going and getting a banknote that was supposedly backed by gold and silver from a particular bank, these ones were now backed by the authority of the government. And so what this was trying to address was the issue of trust. And so, further away you got from a bank, less you were likely to trust its banknotes. If they were backed by the government, then the trust in the currency could be widespread at least across the British Isles, if no further than that. They developed a way of controlling the availability of credit, because if you think about how banknotes were issued, basically they were supposed to have gold and silver in their vaults, and they would issue the banknotes against that gold and silver. So if a ship arrived in port with gold and silver on it, you would have a big increase in liquidity. Similarly, if you loaded up a boat with gold and silver, send it off, do some sort of payment somewhere, then liquidity would dry up in the system. And this was reasonably problematical because with wide fluctuations in liquidity, there was wide fluctuations in interest rates if you wanted to obtain some credit. So in almost a stroke of genius, they started using these things called consols. Now, these are just debt securities. They were issued by the government. They had been around for over a century at this point. They began to use these to control the liquidity in the system. So if they wanted to take some liquidity out, they say there's too much liquidity there, interest rates are too low, what they could do was sell consols, and they would bring in the cash, and that would lower the level of liquidity. So, for example, if a boat arrived with gold and silver, it's going to boost liquidity, they could sell consols to reduce the amount. And similarly, if they loaded up a boat with gold and silver and sent it off and liquidity dropped away, then they could buy consols from the various banks and put liquidity back into the system. And that was an early form of open market operations, which once you recognize how they're done, and we'll come to exactly how they do them, this is where it all started, back in the around 1860s. Now, most central banks have to do a lot of forecasting about a lot of things, and back in those days, they even had a weather vane sitting up on the roof to try to forecast the arrival times of ships, which then allowed them to act appropriately if the liquidity was going to go up or down. And that weather vane apparently is still there, even though it's actually not used anymore for the purpose that it was originally installed. So let's go on from. So one of the final ones that it acquired was this lender of last resort. So normally we would expect, and even in those days, they expected that under normal circumstances, if a bank was getting low in liquidity, it would simply borrow from another bank. But if they couldn't do that, say a bank couldn't borrow from another bank, usually because of an issue of trust, then they could come to the central bank and acquire additional liquidity to get them through a period of low liquidity. Now, what this really allowed them to do was to get this information, otherwise confidential information on the bank's operations, because liquidity problems tend to occur very suddenly, and they needed to know whether the bank was actually basically sound, apart from the liquidity problem, or whether it was in serious trouble, for example, it was bankrupt. Because if it's just a liquidity problem, then a central bank can step in to supply it, to get it through this little tight patch, and hopefully things will turn out fine. Now what that did, because it had to know ahead of time, and it began to collect this otherwise confidential information of them, it paved the way for prudential supervision of the financial system. And finally, the last thing that made it what we would recognize today as a central bank was late in the 1800s, nearly 200 years after it got started, it provided the interbank settlement services. So instead of a bank presenting checks to another bank, drawn that, you present them to the central bank. The central bank would then go about all the things necessary to make sure that the money went where it needed to. So a true modern central bank is no more than maybe 120 years old, maybe 130. So if you think about banks and even banking systems, at least 4,000 years, possibly longer. Central banks, 120, 130 years. They're very recent, but they're very widespread, and everybody considers they're critically important, and now no one can imagine a world without them. So that's where they came from, just developed in response to various problems that were going on. So what does the central bank do? Not all of them do the same thing, but these 5 things here in this group, if they do all of these, then they're considered to be a full-services central bank, and both the Reserve Bank of Australia and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand are full-services central banks. So they develop the monetary policy, and we'll talk about exactly how they actually manage that fairly soon, issue currency, that's the notes and coins, provide banking services to the government, oversee the operation of the financial system. Sometimes that's prudential, sometimes it's not. In New Zealand, the Reserve Bank has the prudential oversight of that system, and then the payment system so that money can be moved as necessary between buyers and sellers. So if they do all that, then they're considered to be a full services bank, and R1 is certainly one of those. Now, as we move into thinking about their monetary policy, how they manage it, one of the first things they have to do when they have their meetings about setting the interest rate is they start to look at all sorts of financial and economic data. And one of the things they start to look at is the money supply. Now, what they look at and why they look at it depends on what you think money is for. So let's take this first one here. Money is a safe place to store value. What do we mean when we say that? When we say money is a safe place to store value, what do we mean? Oh, yep, go ahead.
Let's say you're a farmer back 4,000 years ago and you had 20 cows, but you didn't want your 20 cows, but you wanted the value of your 20 cows. It's easier to look after so much of a bag of gold or notes than it is to look after the value of 20 cows. And then what it also means is that, yeah, so basically it's easier to protect.
Okay, so like if you had 20 cows, you sold them and you got a bag of gold, okay, instead of having a herd of cows, you got a bag of gold. It's much easier, hopefully, to protect, well, then probably easier to rob you if you got a bag of gold. And then that, hopefully the bag of gold will hold its value, and at some stage you'll probably use that. Anyone here work part-time? Anyone got a part-time job? You do? Yeah. So what do you do? You're an NCA tutor? Yeah. Okay, so let's think about that job. So in one sense, by tutoring, are you self-employed? Or you are? Oh, okay, I'll try somebody else. Sorry, no offense about being self-employed. But someone actually employed. Yeah, what do you do?
Delivery driver.
You're a delivery driver. Okay, that'll do. That's a good example. So in one sense, what you're doing, when you're driving your van and you're delivering things, is that you're creating value for your employer. Now, some of that they keep for themselves, and hopefully that ends up in their profits. But some of that value that you have created by your delivery, they pay you in money. And In some cases, depending on what you did, say you worked at a supermarket, they could pay you in goods and services. But barter is really hard. So in many cases, it's much, much easier simply to pay you the value that you have created with your work in money, and then you can keep that. So you've created value by your work, they give you money, and you can keep that until such time as you actually want to use it. So if you created this value, you have this money, and you want to, say, go to the movies, then you would use some of the value that's been stored there. And that's what we're talking about when we're storing value. We're creating value somehow, whether it's farming, working, whatever it is, and then the money is where that value is stored until such time as you actually want to access the value. What about the second one there? When we say money is primarily transactional, what do we mean? Jeff, thank you.
It means that it's just very easy to trade. Like with the example of cows, if someone didn't want cows, then you have nothing to trade, you have nothing to earn. But you can trade money very easily with people.
Yeah, that's the key point, is that if you have to barter, like say we're going to trade cows, you have to find someone who wants exactly what you have to trade. That can be very difficult. But trading with money is fairly straightforward. You simply go and there's some value specified and you pay that. And so these are the two ideas about money. Now, in one sense, they're just mirror images of it. It's like a coin, you've got one side, one's the other. But they're the two things that basically drive the measures of the money supply. And when the central banks look at those money supply, the measure tends to reflect one or the other. So these are the ones that they use. M1 is the currency plus the current accounts at depository institutions. Which measure of those, money is a safe place to store value, or money is primarily transactional, would the M1 reflect? So if a bank's looking at M1, what are they really, in terms of those two definitions of money, which of those does the M1 measure reflect? Yeah, go ahead.
Transactional, because it's all the money that will be used in transactions.
Yeah, that's right. So the currency, your notes and coins, that is ready to go now. Current accounts means that you can draw it out at any point, and typically, like if you have an FPOS card, it'll be against some sort of account like this. So this is money that's ready to go now. So in terms of those two ideas, this money here in the M1, when they measure the M1 supply, is money that's ready to transact now. Now, the Reserve Bank of Australia doesn't use the M2, but it's quite common elsewhere. It includes everything in M1 plus savings and other time deposits. The Reserve Bank of Australia uses the M3, which is very similar. So it's got the savings accounts and time deposits in them, and other bank deposits in the non-bank private sector. So this one here, which one does that reflect? Store of value or transactional? Store of value? Yeah. Okay. And if you think like, for example, a time deposit, something like a term deposit, say you make a year-long term deposit, you've chosen to store the value of that money for a year. So by doing that, you've essentially said, I'm not going to use it for another year. I'm going to store it. I'm going to stick it in a term deposit. So when the reserve banks of the world are looking at their money supply, and sometimes these meetings, like the U.S. meetings, are 2 days long. This is just one of a huge mass of information they look at. These ones reflect different aspects of money, but they look at them to see how the money supply is going, whether it's growing enough, whether it needs to grow faster or slower, and they consider that as part of their work. Before I roll the thing over, does anyone else want to ask a question at this point? Okay. There is, Abby. Okay. So there's several more. This thing called broad money, which isn't really that much different from M3. The basic addition here is that there are a group of financial institutions called non-bank financial institutions. One good example is a finance company. And if it's borrowed from the private sector, say, for example, a finance company has issued a debenture, it's brought some money in, that would be included here. But you take off the currency and the bank deposits that these things have with the banks. And basically the reason you take that off is so you don't double count this money. Another one that they look at is called the money base. There's your currency that's held by private citizens usually. the value that the banks themselves hold at their reserve bank, and any other liabilities that the Reserve Bank may have. Now, those things together aren't particularly large. And this one here, the money base, is sometimes called high-powered money, basically because that is money that is the most liquid, most easily available, ready-to-go money now. Now, this thing's getting a bit old, but anyway, it illustrates the point. If you think about what those things did, this one here, M1, this is your transactional money. And you can see there, this is in billions of dollars. Most recent number they have, about 280 billion. This one here has all those time deposits, so this is the store of value measure. And you can see it's vastly larger, almost at $1.5 trillion. So there's a lot of money that's in the financial system that people have, but is not available for trading or transacting with now. It's stored. The value is stored somewhere, term deposit, time deposit, savings accounts, and so on. And you can see these other ones, like here's the currency, 51 billion in currency, and that money base isn't that much bigger because it basically includes the stuff that's at the central bank. So there's very little difference between the currency and the money base, just a little bit extra, and that's the stuff that's basically held for the central bank. Anyone want to ask a question on any aspect of that before we move on? Okay, move on. So the reserve banks of the world, our one included, it can control the liquidity in the financial system. And what we have in the financial system is a key part of it, which is called the exchange settlement account. And what I'll do, now, here's my top of my paper, is if we think about this thing, there's a thing called the exchange settlement account, and within that, this system is run by the central bank. And in New Zealand, only registered banks have accounts here. In Australia, it's a little bit wider than just the registered banks. They have some other institutions in there, but they have accounts in here. So, for example, let's make a little simple system. This one's owned by the ANZ, and then we've got an account here for this one's for the BNZ, and then make this account here for the Westpac, and there's no more. So. This is the point, this is where the central bank does its operations, and this is where it manages the liquidity. It doesn't manage it anywhere else than other in this exchange settlement account system. Now, this is remarkably small. The Australian one typically only has just a little over $1 billion in it, and so almost all the money in the financial system is outside this thing here. And so when we look at how they do their monetary policy, how they manage it, one thing, the key thing to remember is that the exchange settlement account system is very small, and that's one of the reasons why it's really hard to make the thing actually work properly. So this particular system, in terms of what the central bank does, this system is there for banks to settle between themselves. So if you think like, say you go over to a cafe, you use your EFTPOS card to buy, filled roll for lunch, and you bank at the ANZ, and the cafe owner has their bank account at the BNZ. You think, well, how does the money actually get over there in the end? Well, in the end, it actually travels through the system. So it'll come out of your account, it'll be batched up somewhere along there because it's a low-value transaction, and at some point, it'll get transferred within this system to the BNZ, and ultimately the cafe owner will get your money. So this is what this system is there to carry out the settlement. And the money in there are called exchange settlement funds. Oh, there's the thing there, exchange settlement funds. They are simply dollars and cents. There's actually no difference between them and any other money. It's just that they're inside this system, and this is the system that's used to settle between banks. So it's the interest rate in this particular market that the central banks of the world manage. For us, we've got an exchange settlement account system, and the Reserve Bank of New Zealand manages this particular system, and they manage the interest rate in this particular system. And this is the only one that they have direct management of. So in terms of trying to manage the wider economy, they collect a whole lot of financial and economic data, and then ultimately the decision they make is about what to do inside this particular system. Now, the other key part of this, we'll close this thing off down here, is the government. Now, if money goes from, say for example, it's tax day, and some customers at the ANZ owe tax to the government, what will happen is that this money will come out of the ANZ's ESA account and travel down here for tax. Now, when that happens, it actually changes the amount of money inside the system, because transactions between banks doesn't change it. So if anybody at Westpac pays anybody at the BNZ, the money just changes inside the system. But if it goes to the government, the money actually vanishes and the supply goes down. Similarly, like for example, if it's payday at Department of Health, money will coming from the government and going into the system, and that will boost the amount of funds within this system. So let's address this question here. So there's actually two parts to it. There's that part of the question, and then there's over here about what happens to the cash rate. So let's draw up our little system here. Here's our system. Here's our ESA system here. And we'll just put these 3 banks in it. Nice little simple system with 3 banks. And there's the ANZ. There's the BNZ. And there's our Westpac. And there's a little bit of difference there. And down here is the government. What's going to happen in this system when the government pays these pensions? So, government's going to pay pensions. What happens? Liquidity increases. Why is that? Okay, so money's coming in from the government, going into their accounts. It goes in here, and so this is going to increase liquidity. So if it, say for example, let's make this red. So basically, what's happening here is the government is putting dollars in terms of pensions into the system, and that'll make these things bigger, because they've added liquidity to here. And depending on where these particular pensioners hold their accounts, if you have a lot of them at ANZ, ANZ will get a lot of money. If not many of them have Westpac accounts, then Westpac will get some, but not a lot. So the second part of the question, which is over the page, what happens to the cash rate? Okay, because the cash rate is the interest rate in this particular market. Because if ANZ got low on its cash, it would simply borrow from someone else. And we only got 2 in there to borrow from. And they would charge some interest. So if we boost the supply in there, now think back to your supply and demand, what happens to the interest rate in this particular market? Go up, down, stay the same. It goes down. You don't sound very certain. It goes down. Why is that? Think of it in terms of supply and demand. If I draw a supply and demand curve from, remember these things from way back, like last year. So there's your quantity along there. There's your interest rate up there. That's your price. Now, typically we put the demand curve sloping down, and then we'll put the supply curve going up. So this is where it was before the government got around to making this payment. So if the government has made this payment, so here's the payment, it's going in up here, it increases the supply in this system. So before they put the money in, the interest rate was at this point here, And what's happened is, things moved over. These dollars have filled the thing up, and this is the pensions here coming in from the government. That's pushed that supply over, and that pushes the interest rate down. Now, that has consequences, hopefully, for the rest of the world, well, rest of the economy. But basically what's happened here is if money has come in from the government, supply has gone up, demand, we didn't move, and as a consequence of that, the interest rate goes down. Does everybody follow that, or you want to ask a question about it? You get it? Good, good, good. Okay. Anybody want to ask a question on that bit? Okay. So let's take the second one. The Reserve Bank of Australia sells government securities to Australian investors. So we'll make a new system. So start off, make a new system up here. Here's our ESA system. We're back to where we started from. And so there's our three banks in our mini system. There's the ANZ, there's the BNZ, and there's our Westpac there. And we'll shove the government in just for fun. Government's down here. And we'll put the Reserve Bank, I'll make a New Zealand one here. Okay. So what happens when the Reserve Bank of New Zealand in this case, oops, where's my Reserve Bank gone to? There it is. Okay, my Reserve Bank is now about to sell government securities to these account holders. What happens in that situation? Go ahead.
You see how it goes up because basically the investors, in order to buy those government securities, they're going to put their money, like their cash, and they're going to give it to the government, which will decrease the amount of cash that's in circulation.
Okay. So overall, it reduces the amount of money in the system.
Yeah, so that will increase the...
And then push that interest rate up. Okay, so we'll take that step by step. So the money actually goes to the Reserve Bank, not to the government, because this one's... Yeah, this one here, that's the Reserve Bank of Australia or New Zealand, sells government securities that actually it owns itself. So what happens is that, these securities go up to these, they've bid for them, and so, the securities are sold to these particular banks. They go in that direction, and these were securities that the central bank actually owned on its own account. Now, of course, what happens is that these people here banks have to pay for it. So there's got to come money coming out of these ones, and they go to the central bank there. There's your dollars in payment. And that just makes this thing smaller. So if we think in terms of supply and demand, let's shift this up a bit. So there's our quantity, there's our interest rate there, there's our demand again, and there's where we were, our supply before we made the change. Which way does the supply line move in this type of operation when it sells these things? Where does the supply line move? That's this one here, supply line. Where does that go when we undertake this operation? Shifts to the left. That's that way. Okay. So what's happened is that this has moved over here, and so the payment has gone out to the Reserve Bank. That's your dollars. And that ends up with your new supply there. There's where your interest rate was. It was here. And it's gone up. And it's now here, at this point here. So a change in the volume of money in this system. Oops, hang on. Here's my supply. There's my supply. So again, demand has not changed. In both cases, the previous case and this case, the demand for funds, for banks trading amongst themselves, that demand has not changed. But what has happened is that the amount of money in the system has gone down because when it sold these securities to the banks, they paid with money. That's reduced the amount of money in the system, and that pushes the supply back, and that, as a consequence, pushes that interest rate up. And the interest rate in this market, in New Zealand, it's called the official cash rate. I think in Australia, it's just simply called the cash rate. Okay, any questions on that one before we go to the third one of these? Okay. So we'll make another one. And so here's our ESA system again. Now, I push it up a bit. There it is. There's our 3 banks. There's the ANZ. There's the BNZ. And finally, last of all, there's Westpac. And we'll pop the government in there just for completeness. And then we'll put our Reserve Bank, RBNZ down here. Now, is that going to show up? There we go. Okay. Let's say, for example, of the banks going to raise funds by an overseas note issue, let's say it was ANZ. Say they needed some money, so they trundle off overseas and they sell some banknotes. How does that affect what's going on here? If it does at all, of course. Going to get money from overseas, going to issue banknotes, and they're going to end up with some money. How does that affect the system, if at all? What do you think happens?
You issue the banknote.
Overseas.
Does that mean that you get money from them?
Yeah, you're selling them your 90-day bank bill, and they're paying you.
Yeah, which means the liquidity is up, which means the interest rates are going down.
Okay, so how on earth does that money get into the system? Okay, I'm leading you on. Sorry, forgive me. In actual fact, this entire transaction takes place outside the system. There's nothing happens in here at all. So basically, what happens is that it sends them, it sells bank bills. Bank bills, say the 90-day bank bills. It goes off there, and the money that comes back doesn't come back inside the system. But if they issued it overseas, in a foreign currency, it might go through the foreign exchange system. If, say, for example, they issued it in US dollars and they want it New Zealand want New Zealand dollars, it may go through the foreign exchange system. If it's issued in New Zealand dollars, it simply comes back. And the vast majority of the money in the financial system is not in here, and this particular transaction, raising funds by an overseas note issue, makes no difference at all to this system. The money simply does not come in here. It stays outside. So the key points, there's key points in terms of what they're going to do when they actually manage this, is there's 2 things that are critical. Let me grab them. One is, if there's money going to or from the government, and that's this one here, that will make a difference to the system. That will make a difference to the interest rate there. The other one, if the money goes to or from the central bank, that will change the volume of money in here. That will change the interest rate in this market. But all other transactions make no difference. And so when you get one like this one here, where the transaction, not very clear, is completely outside the system, it makes no difference to the volume of money in here. It makes no difference to the interest rates that's charged in this particular market. Okay, so we've looked at 3 cases. Any questions on any of those before we move on? Yeah, go ahead.
Just wondering, for the third one, if they raise the fund from the overseas, is it going to do any changes to the currency?
Oh, to the currency?
Yeah.
I mean, if it's, the currency markets is simply a supply and demand. And say, for example, they issued it in a foreign currency. They say they issued it in the United States, got US dollars, but they want to bring it back. Then the very fact that they're selling a bunch of US dollars to get New Zealand dollars is going to affect the currency, the exchange rate. So that would affect, simply supply and demand. Selling a bunch of US dollars, big supply there, big demand from New Zealand dollars. That will drive the currency either up or down, as the case may be. Okay, so, but that is completely outside the ESA system. That's done in the foreign exchange markets. Okay, any other questions? Okay, move along. Actually, if you're wondering about these blank slides here, when I had my meeting with class reps at the end of term 1 last year, they asked for some blank slides so they can draw these pictures. Now, at that point, of course, we're already halfway through the course, so if you think you need more blank slides, let me know and I will shove them in for next year's people. But anyway, that's why we've got blank slides. Okay, so basically to summarize, the interest rates, they're determined by the market. They're determined by supply and demand, okay? And the central banks have basically no control whatsoever over the demand. That's why we left that demand part of it completely unchanged. Now, if there's payments going out to the government, that decreases the supply. Payments coming in increase it, and that will change the supply. That's why we moved those supply lines. If they don't do anything, they just let it sit there and do its own thing, this can really make the interest rates swing around. In fact, there was a time in New Zealand when they got it seriously wrong, and we had an overnight rate of close to 900%. That was only for one day, of course, when they really messed this up, and they didn't have enough money in there. And of course, when they scrambled to try to borrow, those that actually had excess, they could really charge a lot. But they got better at it, so they don't do that anymore. So basically, if you leave it to do its own thing, these interest rates would just swing around all over the place. And so one of the main jobs of a central bank is to make sure that thing's pretty stable. Now, the question is, why do they even look at this thing? If you look at your book and you think about what it says there about the size of this thing, they say, I think the number that they give there is 0.04% of bank assets are inside here. That means that 99.96% of all other assets are somewhere else. So, given it's really, 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 really tiny, why do people care about this? Why do people care about it? It's just tiny. Why is it important? Go ahead.
That is something to do with the opportunity cost. Like, if the OCR is low, then they encourage people to spend more.
Well, if the OCR is low, all that means is that the bank inside the system can trade inside that system with that low interest rate. It doesn't directly affect any other interest rates in the economy. Okay? So if the OCR is low, that means that banks can trade themselves amongst themselves at a low interest rate. That's all that can happen. Okay? I mean, that's important. Running out of time. Okay. Anybody else? I mean, you're sort of on the right track. If you just think about it a bit more, you'll get there. Any other ideas? Okay, so one of the things is that this is supposed to be like just the start of everything. So the interest rate here, if you move this to here, okay, this is the only interest rate that the central bank actually has control of in the entire economy. So this overnight bank rate is the only thing it has control of. And there's interest rates, everything from 1 day through to 30 years. What they try to do is if they move this interest rate here, they hope that the movements that they do in this market will feed through to the rest of the economy over time. Now, that can be very slow to occur, but if they move up the cash rate, what you tend to see is that the short-term interest rates, 30 days, 90 days, will start to move up quite quickly. And hopefully, over a long period of time, long rates will move. And so what they hope to do, is by moving the interest rate here, is to affect the entire structure of the interest rates across all times to maturity. And hopefully, through that, they will manage the economy. Now, as you can imagine, with that sort of description, this is, A, it's slow to work when it does work, but often it's very ineffective. So I think we're burning out of time slowly. Let's say I've said that. Yeah. Key point here is that it is set by supply and demand. This is a market rate. And okay, so we'll start at this point. Start this point here tomorrow, and hopefully finish this off. If you want to ask any questions, we'll be around for a few minutes. Otherwise, we'll pick up at this point and finish it tomorrow.
I was just wondering, just like out of interest in terms of how they use the OCR to control inflation, has there ever been a case where they've put it so low and they still want it to go in that direction, but you can't really have negative?
No, there are definitely negative interest rates, and some of the central banks have actually used a negative interest rate policy as part of their policy. And at one stage, and the age is sort of past a little bit. There was one stage when I think there was 16 countries that had negative interest rates. In fact, Switzerland even had a negative interest rate on a 10-year government bond. So, oh, I see. Okay, that's fine. I'll make sure it gets to the right place. Yep.
Textbook, I thought it says that central banks can sell foreign reserves or in order to manipulate the money supply.
Yes, they can, because they manage the foreign reserves on behalf of the government. So the foreign currency that they hold is the foreign currency that's held by the government. So that's who owns it.
Affect the cash rate if the money supply increases.
Yeah, if they traded in the foreign exchange market themselves, if the Reserve Bank traded in the foreign exchange market, it can move the exchange rate and it can move the cash rate. Now, when we talk about in the section on foreign exchange, we'll talk about what we call a sterilized interventions. That is where they simultaneously trade in the foreign exchange market and in this, so that they move the exchange rate, but they don't move the cash rate. So, yeah, if they themselves trade in that market, it will, because it has trades in there, it can affect the cash rate. Yeah, they can neutralize it.
Thank you. No, I just want to say thank you for sending out the email. I'm Leah.
Okay, right.
Okay, no.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm just wondering, before you said that they're going to change the OCR, that hopefully they're going to affect the whole economy in the country.
Yeah, that's the hope.
So which means that they could be a wrong decision, is that? Consider that, like I read the slides before, it says it's going to affect the OCR going to affect the stock market, like quite in like some years. But like for example in New Zealand, I've noticed that they change the OCR quite frequently, like recently.
Yeah, the thing is that monetary policy has always been relatively ineffective. Since the crisis, it's got even less and less effective. In fact, there are several times where central bankers have basically said we've run out of the ability to manage the economy. These tools are not working anymore.
Yeah.
And even in the days before the crisis, when things were good, it would typically take 18 months or longer for a change in the monetary policy to actually start to even affect the wider economy. So it's always been slow, but it's definitely become slower since the crisis. And
so nowadays, how come they don't figure out some more efficient way?
Well, that's a critical problem. Is that central bankers, like our government bank, basically he said at one point, and they said I should sack him because he said it. He said we're basically out of ideas. Yeah, They tried quantitative easing. They tried negative interest rates, actually below zero.
Yeah.
And none of these things really work very well. None of them work. And they, in terms of what a central bank can do, you know, it can encourage.
Yeah.
Like if you encourage expansion, it can encourage the economy to slow down.
Yeah.
But all the actual decisions are made by, particularly by the private sector, or sometimes in terms of government, central government spending, and they don't have control over that.
Okay.
So basically, they can encourage
Yeah.
or discourage,
Yeah.
but they cannot control.
So in that case, like in